Even though the skies were often dark and dreary, the future looked brilliant and bright in Whiting, Indiana. New wooden sidewalks and new shops were coming, and most importantly, there were new jobs. It was 1895. Just 6 years earlier, Whiting was not much more than a stop on the rail lines to Chicago. But in 1889, the Standard Oil Company built a huge refinery in Whiting. Workers and their families flocked here, and they were looking for homes. A group of Chicago men created a housing development, which they named Rockefeller Park. To attract buyers, they offered good financing options for the $100 lots. They also held an open house featuring the Rockefeller Park Band, playing the majestic Rockefeller Park March, a song written to celebrate the new neighborhood. The development was named after John D. Rockefeller, who was, in a sense, a neighbor. The richest man in America. He owned the Standard Oil Company, and his new refinery was just across the street from Rockefeller Park. The only problem was, no one asked John D. Rockefeller if they could use his name for this housing development. He sued, and the name of the development was changed to Stiglitz Park, after Gustav Stiglitz, one of the developers. 60 years later, Stiglitz Park was still an easy walk to work at a time when most families either had one car or no car at all. In 1955, there were about 180 houses and over 700 people living in Stiglitz Park. Most were still in bed on the morning of August 27, 1955, a Saturday, at 6:12 a.m., 1 minute after sunrise, unaware that in seconds, the lives of everyone in Stiglitz Park were about to change forever.
Growing up in Whiting back then was pretty damn good for a kid. I mean, we were pretty much free to go anywhere. There were no safety issues.
Well, I know I would ride my bike all over Stiglitz Park. Back then it was safe. We would go out riding our bikes, and as long as we were home by dark, it was fine.
Standard Oil has been in our family. So many people have worked at Standard Oil.
I think if you would ask anybody, what does your dad do? Whiting, Standard Oil.
Living as close as we did to the refinery, it was a common thing to have minor explosions, if you can call them minor, and fires. It was just something that we learned to live with and got along with.
In March 1955, construction was completed on the tallest structure in the Whiting refinery, 26 stories tall. It was called a hydroformer, the first of its kind in the Whiting refinery. It was built to produce the high-octane gas that modern cars required. On the morning of August 27, 13 men were working on the hydroformer, which had been shut down for maintenance. They were ready to start it back up. What they did not know was that gas used to heat the system during startup had become contaminated with vapors from a highly flammable gas. They also didn't know that oxygen had been leaking into the system for several hours. The combination of high temperatures and high pressure inside the hydroformer, with a mixture of oxygen and contaminated gases, produced an earth-shattering explosion that shook the city awake.
Oh, it was a boom, boom that went about. I mean, you had to be like put under with heavy sleeping pills or something not to feel that, because we felt it, heard it.
You just felt this incredible boom, and literally I fell out of bed.
We were sleeping early in the morning. We were sleeping, and all of a sudden I hear this boom, and I jumped up out of bed and heard things falling, So I ran into the front where the store was. We lived behind it. And I ran to the front of it, and all this stuff was coming off the shelves and falling on the floor and made the noise and whatnot.
All the windows in the house shook. My husband and I both jumped out of bed, out of a deep sleep, thinking, oh, gee whiz, it's raining. We've got to close all the windows. So the rain doesn't come in, it was thunder. We thought it was thunder.
And Daddy thought it was the end of the world. And we're Christians. We believe in Jesus Christ as our Savior. And the Bible speaks of the end of the world. So, of course, that's what Daddy thought right away.
I looked out the window and I saw the big mushroom go up. And I said, holy moly, he dropped the atom bomb.
I thought it was a bomb. I just thought it was a bomb.
My dad had I don't want to say a premonition, but when he saw the smoke outside of our house, he said, that's got to be Standard Oil. Yeah, he says, there's nothing that big enough to cause an explosion like that other than Standard Oil.
The blast was felt not just in Whiting, but over 30 miles away in Michigan City.
I was in the hospital at Michigan City, St. Anthony, having a baby when the explosion occurred. I thought it was an earthquake, and because that's what it felt like.
The blast was also felt over 100 miles away near Holland, Michigan, where Congressman Gerald Ford was staying with his family. It woke up the future president and his neighbors, many of whom ran outside because they thought it was an earthquake. But it was across the street from the refinery in Stiglitz Park, a neighborhood which was as close as 600 feet from the blast, where it was most strongly felt. The power of the blast knocked houses off their foundations and shattered virtually every glass window. The walls of the hydroformer were made of 3-inch thick steel, but the blast broke them into pieces. Those pieces flew in all directions and came raining down on Stiglitz Park.
There was a big chunk of steel that landed on the curb at the front of our house on the curbing area of the street. It was a piece of the hydroformer, and it was about 4 feet square. We were sleeping about maybe 10 to 15 feet from that area because we were downstairs.
A flying chunk of steel landed on a grocery store, demolishing it. A 10-ton piece of metal destroyed a garage. The powerful blast drove a 10-foot-long wooden plank into the side of a house. A sheet of steel traveled 3 blocks and crushed a parked car. A sharp piece of metal embedded itself into the concrete pavement. 14-year-old Dennis Hiddle was delivering the morning newspapers in Stiglitz Park, as hundreds of pieces of metal and debris fell all around him. He ran home, where his parents were in a near state of panic until they saw him. Amazingly, no one in Stiglitz Park was injured or killed by the flying metal debris. None of the 13 working on the hydroformer were seriously injured. No one in the refinery was injured by the initial blast. But occupants of one house in Goose Island, a neighborhood just to the west of Stiglitz Park, were not as fortunate. Frank and Joan Pluniak and their 2 sons lived at 2638 Schrog Avenue. 3-year-old Ricky and 8-year-old Ron shared a bedroom.
Sleep in the bedroom, and it was August, so I normally would sleep with my head at the other end of the bed, but because it was hot, I slept by the window. So I flipped around, and actually my feet were where my head was.
A steel pipe from the hydroformer traveled about 2,000 feet and hit the house, crashing into the bedroom where the boys slept.
When the pipe came into the house, it would have landed across my legs. It would have landed across my head. Like I was in a dense fog with plaster dust all over the place. All I saw was white dust. So I got down on my hands and knees. I crawled out of the bedroom. I still didn't know that I lost my leg.
The same pipe that sliced off Ron's leg hit Ricky, who was in the bed next to him. Ricky was killed instantly. The flying debris punctured about 20 oil storage tanks. One piece of steel, weighing 60 tons, flew through the air at 40 miles per hour, demolishing a storage tank when it landed. The storage tanks which were hit caught fire, a fire which began to spread.
It was like a fire going from house to house. It was going from tank to tank. You could see them erupting in the big balls of fire.
It was just kind of horrific, just seeing one after another. And then
start thinking, is that how, is that coming down toward us?
Fire crews from Whiting, Hammond, East Chicago, Gary, Chicago, and at least 6 other fire departments came to help.
The firemen, they had hoses just everywhere at the time, and trying to keep the heat from blowing up some of the tanks. They had water going on the tanks and anything that they could see that was smoking.
Most of the firefighting was handled by Standard Oil's own fire department. The company trained workers to fight small fires. It even had a team of over 90 canaries stationed throughout the plant, which were sensitive to gases humans could not detect. 57-year-old Frank Horlbeck was the chief of the refinery's own fire department. He had 11 full-time men. He had another 300 workers highly trained to help in an emergency, and he had another 300 partially trained to provide support. Refinery workers not trained to fight such a huge fire were given other duties.
Pretty soon it's 8 o'clock and nobody's going home. For some reason, they give us everybody a shovel and we take off walking towards, 129th, and Juice Stack Trucking put sand all the way on Indianapolis Boulevard.
Almost every trucking company in the area volunteered to haul in what became 2,500 loads of sand that were needed to keep the oil from spreading. Other workers who were not on duty rushed to the refinery to help. 63-year-old Walter Ray, a foreman at the plant, arrived on the scene to help shut off the valves that fed oil to the tanks. Shortly after he arrived, he had a heart attack and died. Meanwhile, oil from a ruptured tank flowed across Indianapolis Boulevard, a major U.S. highway, and was just a few feet away from the homes in Stiglitz Park. The pavement on Indianapolis Boulevard caught on fire, but the fire crews were able to keep the flames out of the residential neighborhood. The residents of Stiglitz Park and neighboring Goose Island were told to evacuate. Most complied.
The Whiting police were patrolling our neighborhood later in the day, ordering us to prepare for evacuation. My mom prepared a package with necessities, clothing and food, what little we could take, and next thing you know, we were off and gone.
We were out of that house in just moments. You can imagine getting 7 children in the car, and Mom and Dad. And we took off for Grandma and Grandpa's.
There was the store, McClellan's Grocery, the next block. Actually, it was across the street from that one boy who got killed. And he didn't want to leave the neighborhood, they had to force him out.
But the older Polish people and everything that lived here, they wouldn't leave.
Many of those who evacuated stayed with relatives or friends, some far from the fire.
We stayed at relatives in South Chicago. And for me, it was quite nice because there were 2 girls that were my age. And we camped out on the living room floor for 3 or 4 days. And we just had fun. The fire was in Whiting and we were away from the fire. We were safe, so we didn't worry about it then.
People who had to leave home and who had minor injuries began showing up at Whiting City Hall because they had nowhere else to go. Anne DeVoy was the city nurse at the time, and she was still dressed for sleep when she heard a knock.
And I went to the door. It was the police. They said, "Annie, the mayor said you gotta come quick. There's about 25 people sitting on the sidewalk in front of City Hall. They're urgently wanting you to come so that you could take the glass out of their feet." So I run to the City Hall, hair and rollers. I look like the wrath of God, but I went.
Windows were shattered throughout Whiting, and broken glass was a danger to people jumping out of bed with no shoes on.
Those people there, their houses, when the blast occurred, their glass in their houses imploded. So the windows all shattered on the sleeping people and all over the floor. Well, who got up first to see what happened was the head of the household, the father. And so most of them were men.
With more people requiring help, The Red Cross quickly converted the Whiting Community Center into a shelter. They served food to the homeless families, provided beds on which the families could sleep, and provided medical care for minor injuries. The volunteers in the kitchen prepared nearly 2,000 meals for those in the shelter, and sandwiches and drinks that were delivered to the firefighters. Temperatures that day were in the 90s. By noon, 42 acres of the refinery were either on fire or threatened by it, and the fire was spreading. In the afternoon, another huge explosion rocked the refinery.
One of the naphtha tanks went off, and that was a flame that looked like it was just going up to the sun. It just never stopped. It just went straight up, and it was so hot. It was unreal. I mean, I thought I was going to die.
And all of a sudden, I felt this heat on the back of my neck again. It's like 95 degrees out, and you can feel extra heat on the back of your neck. And I looked around, and there's this great big fireball right above my head, practically. And the heat from that thing is just spectacular.
And I see this huge ball of fire the size of a house across the street rolling towards me, rolling like it's going right over the roofs towards our house. I tell you, the sound of that windows rattling, the heat of it was so hot that I looked down on my arms and I thought they were burning. It felt like they were burning just from the heat.
Because I ran as hard as I could to try to get home, and somebody right there, right off of, between the alley between Birch and New York Avenue, right there, somebody had just cut a bunch of bushes, and I literally dove in those bushes because the heat was so bad.
The policeman, I can remember him screaming, "Don't panic, don't panic." The people were just running along as well as we were running too. But it was scary. That was scary. That was the part that feared them. That was that life and death experience. That was my life and death experience because I thought I was going to die.
The naphtha tank explosion injured several firefighters.
Even though my dad had worn a long-sleeve shirt and cap in August to protect himself from the heat of the fires, the 4 o'clock explosion of flames rolled over the fire truck that he was driving. He received significant burns on his ears and the back of his neck and was taken to one of the nearby hospitals for treatment.
We start running. I ended up on the other side of Shrog Avenue in somebody's backyard. You know, I mean, because I don't think there was anybody that passed me up.
So after that explosion, I says, I'm getting out of here. So I took off. And I ran to the cat cracker, and the first thing I looked at, and I remember that, I looked where the canary was. No canary.
The heat from the tank fires was so intense, it melted steel.
Oh, one thing I remember vividly is them big black tanker railroad cars. They weren't just crushed, they were melted.
Well, the rail cars along the boulevard, tank cars and box cars, were melted like used candles. And that'll give you an idea of the level of heat that was generated such that they would melt like candle wax.
The flames and the smoke were seen in neighboring Gary and Chicago. As the pilot of a TWA flight from New York to Chicago's Midway Airport passed over the area, he said the flames were 500 feet high, and the smoke rose to 6,000 feet.
It was like a rolling smoke. That's how it kept going. It wasn't like a regular fire when you see a fire and it's just smoking. No, this was billowy and rolling, and it seemed like the more we looked at it, the more intense it got and more frightening.
Fear was rapidly spreading.
And I know I was scared to death that there was going to be another explosion or that my dad would get injured or killed. I'm sure my mom was thinking the same thing. So it was very, very frightening. The only thing that I was worried about was my dad because we hadn't seen him all day and we didn't know where he was until he came back from the hospital with his ears all bandaged up and his neck all bandaged up.
At one time, People were talking so much about it, and they said that the whole area was just going to go.
There was a smoking ban during the fire because they were afraid that gasoline might have got into the sewer system, and they were afraid that somebody would throw a match somewhere and maybe cause other explosions or something like that.
A friend of mine was driving in her family's Studebaker car, going down, which is the end of Shrug, which we call a Goose Island area, and they saw people running, scared, looking for a safe place. The manholes covering the sewers were blowing up in the air. That whole area, they were blowing up and people were running scared.
I'm walking past a manhole cover, and just as I got past it, that sucker went. And then they were all popping like tiddlywinks.
Certainly was a time in Whiting where we thought the whole city was going to go up.
The city of Chicago sent its fireboat to the nearby Indiana Harbor ship canal, just in case the oil slicks on the water caught on fire. The National Guard was called in to keep looters away from the evacuated homes in Stiglitz Park and Goose Island. Whiting Police Chief James Mullaney sent 27 of his men to the scene. The Lake County Sheriff sent 100 officers, and policemen from numerous neighboring cities helped out. The American Legion mobilized 100 members who reported for duty with their rifles. There was not a single report of looting. In the days before interstate highways, Indianapolis Boulevard was a major national highway. The National Guard and the police shut it down.
We closed off, we actually put up roadblocks actually at every intersection leading into the city.
The roads were closed to keep people safe, but also to keep them out of the way.
There's a lot of people just walking and looking, and there's a lot of people that went to watch the fire. I remember the police and the fire personnel kept everybody back.
We lived on Broad Street in Markstown, which had an unobstructed view of the plant. And during the days right after the explosion, I can remember many relatives and cousins coming and sitting on our large front porch, watching the fire as if it was a fireworks display at 4th of July. And then occasionally a big plume of orange would go up, and as a new storage tank would be involved, and everybody would say, "There goes another one."
We sat in the yard and watched it for hours. There was just all that black smoke.
Telephone service in the refinery and in much of Whiting was knocked out. The phone company parked a bus by the community center where people could make calls. But many who were out of town knew little about what was going on, and some feared the worst.
I was falling off for Reveille at 6 o'clock or 5:30 in the morning, whatever, and the radio was playing on one of the Foot Lockers. It says, "A big fire at the hydroformer in Whiting, Indiana." Man, I stopped dead in my tracks. But then I had to go out there and get into Reveille, and after that, I seen the company commander. He let me come home.
Like, they called me into the office and said that there was an explosion at Standard Oil and your parents would not be able to pick you up. I thought they were all dead. Had no idea.
Flying home from Fort Knox, the airplane was Eastern Airlines. And as we got over the fire, the pilot announced, "I'm going to bank the plane a little bit to the right so you see the Standard Oil fire."
And I called everybody I knew, whose number I knew, my aunts and uncles and things, and couldn't get through to anybody. I figured they're all just gone.
Yet, for many people in Whiting, even though the fire seemed threatening, life went on.
Well, I was 18 years old, and I was getting married at Immaculate Conception Church here in Whiting on the day that Amoco blew up.
We had a funeral that morning. It was at Cozier's Funeral Home on Indianapolis Boulevard, which was a little difficult getting there because people had to be escorted there, and we had to be escorted to the church.
I had a driver come to pick me up. I had my gown on and everything that morning, and I had a driver come pick me up and said, "You're not going to get married today." I said, "I'm in my gown, I'm getting married today.
They didn't postpone anything. We went on. The church had the mass. We went to the cemetery, and they even had a luncheon because the cooks prepared everything, so they were ready to go. But you know, when you walked out of the hall and looked down the street, it was, oh my God, it looked like an inferno.
One of Joe's best men, or groomsmen, Johnny Tuscan, was in the wedding, and he had to leave. He took his tux off and went to fight the fire during the day, and then came back at night for the reception, which was at St. John Panel Room. We had invited like 400 people, and about 200 had shown up, or 250. So we took the rest of the food and sent it over to Community Center.
My Uncle Steve, who lived on Birch Avenue, was closer to the fire than we were, so they evacuated to our house. And when he dropped his family off, he says, I'm going back. I got a job to do. That's my day off. He's painting. And I'm thinking, painting in the midst of all of this commotion?
We had plans to go to Brookfield Zoo that day. And we decided we would go to Brookfield Zoo in spite of the fire.
By the second day, firefighters brought the blaze under control, but it took 8 days for the fire to burn itself out. Standard Oil chairman, Robert Wilson, announced that the company would compensate everyone for their losses. 2 days after the explosion, an office was opened for people to come in and file their claims. For those living in Stiglitz Park, the company offered to buy their homes.
But Stiglitz Park was gone. Everything gone. Nobody could go back and live there. That was sad. That was her house from when she was just really, really little. And so she was really affected by it. You know, this was her homestead.
I guess we sold out pretty quick. I know there were a lot of homeowners that did not sell. They held out for a year or 2 or 3.
The company eventually bought every building in Stiglitz Park, waiting until the last owner sold in 1973, and then building a field of oil storage tanks where Stiglitz Park once stood. For those in Goose Island and other areas where there was damage, the company moved quickly. They handled around 2,000 claims. Most were small and were settled almost instantly.
They paid for absolutely everything that was damaged. And they wrote a check immediately, as many times as we walked down there.
47 acres of the refinery burned, including 70 oil storage tanks. Losses inside the plant were estimated at $10 million, but Standard Oil had an insurance policy which covered all but $1 million in losses. The explosion proved to be just a temporary setback for Standard. Net earnings in 1955 were up 34%, an all-time high up to then. The workers quickly cleaned up, and the refinery was rebuilt and updated to make it more modern and efficient.
So in the aftermath, it turned out that it was sort of like industrial/urban renewal for Standard Oil, because the place changed radically after that.
All these places, they're planning 5 years ahead of time what they're going to do. Well, what that explosion did, knocked out a lot of the stuff they was going to tear down anyway. So it just escalated everything.
After it was all over, most said it could have been worse.
It's a wonder more people, didn't get killed. It seemed like those things just fell in a variety of places, the pieces.
I think the fortunate thing was that it happened on a Saturday morning when people were pretty much all in their houses at the time.
If you judge an accident by how many died, the 1955 fire was not the worst in the history of the Whiting Refinery. 8 men died when a still exploded on the 4th of July in 1921. There have been many other explosions and fires where workers lost their lives. But what made the 1955 fire different was the power of the blast and the huge fire which followed. It was also the only Whiting Refinery explosion which took the life of someone outside the plant and which destroyed an entire neighborhood.
If you were alive in 55, you remember the explosion.
I'm 72 now, and I can I can still, after all them years, remember, when that
Yeah,
happened.
it's like when Kennedy got shot and the Twin Towers got hit, things like that just stick in your mind.
Mary Ann Dominiak was 16 at the time of the explosion and fire, and wrote a poem about it in the days after.
Well, it's entitled, of course, The Fire of 55. First went the hydroformer, tall and stern. Then the fire began to burn. Sirens were heard loud and clear, because to the houses the fire drew near. Tanks exploded one by one, sounding like the shots from a gun. As flames were rising higher in height, people were running and fleeing with fright. The fire was reaching the naphtha-filled tanks, so bulldozers hurriedly shoveled sandbanks. The naphtha exploded with a loud roar. Hundreds of feet through the air it did soar. The houses nearby, so clean and neat, were touched by the fire and scorched from the heat. The people inside had to take cover as a child who's lost seeking its mother. Taking their possessions, they began to flee, away from the fire, forgetting their key. The houses were left alone and unguarded because the dwellers had hastily departed. The fire was spreading faster and faster, heading to bring newer disaster. The tanks so near in every direction would soon be without any protection. The fire still burning and turning gray, its embers diminished and went away. In a few nights it quieted down, and Whiting again was a peaceful town.